Hi there, Megan Thompson here with Megan Thompson Coaching. And if you are parenting a highly sensitive child, they are stuck in the meltdown cycle and you need help helping them be successful in school, then definitely stick around. Today we're going to talk about whether or not a psychological evaluation is necessary to break out of that meltdown cycle and what works to support your sensitive kid or teen in school. Today, our conversation, 3 myths about psychological evaluations or Psych Evals. Now, here at MTC, we help parents break out of the meltdown cycle, and meltdown cycle is daily, multiple times a day or multiple times a week, shutting down, refusing, melting down, body on the floor, hitting, kicking, screaming, and getting aggressive or threatening to hurt themselves or others. And we help parents do this for children ages 2 through 14. Or work directly with teens and their parents for high school. So today we're going to talk about the challenges that you might be facing as a parent when you're trying to figure out what is going on when the traditional or general parenting strategies are not working and your child or teen is struggling in school. Now, make sure that you are going to stick around even if your child is a quote-unquote perfect angel in school and they are melting down at the end of the day, okay, at home with you. This topic is still relevant, so stay tuned to today's show. There is a time-sensitive focus to today's conversation, so be certain to watch it today or within the next day if you're not able to finish everything today on our show. And I'm going to keep it less than our typical 45 minutes in order to support you with that. Again, 3 myths about Psych Evals. Let's just get right down to it. When your child is struggling and they are saying things like, I'm stupid, I'm a bad kid, school is hard, I don't understand it, it's too busy, or they're shutting down, they're not telling you what's up, you might have a pretty significant struggle with your child. The teacher might be saying that your child is struggling paying attention, struggling to stay on task, struggling to stay in their seat, etc. You could be wondering whether or not your child needs a psych eval to receive support for special education services or just to get some interventions done without special education services. You might be wondering how your child's brain works and thinking about whether or not this level of support is the next service. Now, I want to be covering a few things today in this conversation and getting a pretty clear picture of what Psych Evals do or do not do for highly sensitive children, especially when your child is stuck in the meltdown cycle. And we're going to cover that first and foremost by understanding what a Psych Eval is, because we worked with parents, hundreds of parents breaking out of this pattern. And many parents are not in the mental health field, right? We do have a portion of our clients in the mental health field, but many of our parents are in other avenues of the helping field or not at all, right? Teachers, doctors, nurses, professors, educators, but perhaps not clear on the IEP language, and also, accountants, computer science professionals, etc. So it's not your wheelhouse, right? So first of all, Psych Eval is short for psychological evaluation. This is typically a multiple day long experience for your child where they are put in a situation where they're going to be evaluated by a psychologist. A psychologist has at least 3 years of grad school and they have a doctorate in psychology typically in order to perform a Psych Eval. Now, your child's school might have master's level, which is 2 years of grad school for a psychologist, but where they have a master's degree in psychology, but they would not be called Dr. So-and-so if they didn't have at least 3 years of experience in 3 years of education post bachelor's degree. So master's plus one more year for a doctorate in psychology. And somebody with a doctorate in psychology has more advanced access to psychological testing. Now, the testing that is completed is per the psychologist's discretion. And if this testing is completed via the school system, public school system, then the public school system is going to set up some pretty strict parameters around what types of psychological assessments they are going to pay for and keep on hand and apply to all children who would need it. Now, the psychologist in the school setting would get to choose, but from a very much more limited list than a private psychologist who is going to complete a more in-depth battery of testing. That's the word. Battery of testing is the word for collection of testing. So school testing might take a day or 2 days typically, where the psychologist is going to take your child to a one-on-one room, a small room, and run them through these assessments. And some of the assessments the child will be answering on their own and filling in bubbles and reading and answering questions. Depending on the child's age, they'd be reading it. Or depending on the test and how it's designed, the assessment, the psychologist will be asking a series of questions and the child will be answering or completing activities, some drawing activities, some mental academic activities. And typically academic focus is what the school evaluations are going to focus on. Now, how do I know what I'm talking about, right? So those of you who just got started following me and our company here, I am a licensed clinical professional counselor and a registered play therapist supervisor. I've been working in the mental health field for over a decade, and working with children has been my only specialty in the mental health field. And I've worked in the school settings as well as residential treatment centers and outpatient centers, as well as running my own private practice, group private practice, where I had clinicians working for me. And now I solely run the coaching company that you're interacting with me through here. And we work with parents directly. So as mental health consultants and parenting experts. So for parents of highly sensitive kids stuck in the meltdown cycle. All right, brief rundown. What I can tell you is I have read hundreds of Psych Evals from parents whose kids are around the world, and also primarily in the states that I'm licensed in and where I've been employed prior to working on my own. So primarily the majority of the assessments I was reading were coming from professionals in the DMV area, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. Runs the gamut though, because I was working also in a residential treatment center in Maryland that saw children who were, the center that we were at, where I supervised all the clinicians, we were the end of the road before they were moved out of state, and some children were brought in, teens were brought in from an out-of-state placement. So I do have experience reading psychological evaluations and working directly with psychologists as they were doing those evaluations throughout my career. So that's why I'm qualified to tell you all about them. In this respect related to the specialty of being stuck in the meltdown cycle. So now let's get back to it, right? Let's get back to what one of these myths are. So many times parents, you'll want to figure out how your child ticks, how they think, how they interpret the world, how they're absorbing information, especially if the school is telling you that your child is not on task, struggling with their grades, both for some of them, or is struggling with peer relationships, so much so that it's become a major distraction in the classroom. And what's important to notice is that myth number one, which is for highly sensitive children, it is a myth that psychological evaluations will give a full picture about a highly sensitive child's brain function. Now, it's important to understand why that is. Okay, so we're going to talk about three main points as to why that's not going to give you a big picture and also small picture assessment of your child and how they think and how they operate in the school setting and in the world in general. So first and foremost is that psychological evaluations performed by a psychologist are typically not going to capture sensory overload. Okay, so sensory overload is not just pertaining to the five senses that you're aware of. It is also going to be noticing whether or not your child, the five senses, hearing, tasting, smelling, seeing, and touching. Okay. And the psychologist is not typically going to assess auditory overload or emotional overload, which is not part of that assessment, because this is not their area of expertise. Okay, so there you might find a outside psychologist, somebody who's not working in the school system, to perform measures on auditory processing concerns, auditory processing disorder diagnosis, and that would be something that would be more applicable in a private assessment. Though not always something that a psychologist is trained in, okay? So this is important because when your child is overwhelmed and they're not performing and the teacher sees that the child is distracted, when in reality the child may be experiencing sensory overload due to auditory overload, you might receive a feedback on the psychological evaluation that your child is distractible, right? If they're not testing for sensory overload from a hearing perspective. Classrooms are busy, right? Classrooms are loud, especially for younger children, elementary, middle school. High school, there's still a lot going on in the hallways, et cetera, that can add to that overload. And when that missing component is not measured or measured in the context of the mental health world, which goes to myth number two, or point number two related to this, psychological evaluation is built within the context of a mental health model and a educational model. So it's not a holistic perspective of the child's well-rounded environment to include home, community relationships, and how they experience those. It's only going to test how they take in academic information, and observation is going to be done in the classroom if the psychological evaluation is thorough enough to include a classroom observation. Some don't. And what happens is that the psychologist has a layman's perspective of auditory processing. Some of that might be picked up on a psychological measure, which is another word for psychological test in Psych Eval. It depends on the assessments that they're using, okay? And that misperception could be attributed to the mental health model and putting your child in a category of autism or not, especially because sensory processing disorder is not a mental health diagnosis. And an occupational therapist is typically much more capable of observing that label than a psychologist, especially a psychologist who is primarily trained in the education system. So what happens in these situations is we have a missing puzzle piece that is attributed to a mental health diagnosis rather than a temperament type, which is point 3 for this myth, right? Temperament type, personality type, introvert, extrovert, highly sensitive, not highly sensitive, etc., is not captured in the medical model of a psychological evaluation because they're looking for something wrong, right? They're looking for something wrong. They're looking for categories, and those categories are designed within the mental health industry, and so they're categorized with that context. So it's important to understand that, I've spoken to parents who say, oh yeah, my kid's local professional understands the sensory piece, doesn't think he's on the autism spectrum. There's a wealth of knowledge that's missing here if that's the only component that you're thinking about, or is only talking about the five senses related to to sensory overload and thinking sensory processing disorder. Highly sensitive kids are overwhelmed by intense sensory experiences when they don't have skills to manage their emotions. Their emotions of, I got to get out of here. This is going to lead to a problem. This kid's loud and the teacher's going to get mad, and I'm worried about what that kid is going to think or what's going to happen to that kid. That's an emotional management issue, not a sensory overload issue, where the brain is confused by the loud noise and has a hard time categorizing the loud noise. All right, so overwhelmed due to emotional reaction to the to the yelling in the classroom is completely different. But psychological evaluations are not making those connections. Okay, so one of the things that we teach our parents to assess in our work here, and I want to talk about this with you today. So the next thing that we're going to be paying attention to is myth number 2. Okay. Which is that they provide an in-depth treatment plan for parents or professionals. Now, as a parent, you might be looking at, okay, well, if I understand how my kid thinks and experiences school, then the professional is also going to tell me what I should do, whether I should go get, what sort of services I should go get, and what those service providers should do once I obtain them. And this is a fallacy. Even if you pay, thousands of dollars for a psychological evaluation out of pocket, it is not a guarantee that that provider is going to give you a step-by-step treatment plan. And in fact, in my experience, after reading hundreds and hundreds of these, that is actually an unrealistic expectation. I have seen maybe three that I can count in my memory. I have a pretty good memory of families where they've received a very good psychological evaluation for a highly sensitive child, where treatment plan components were included for what the therapist should do. With that being, if they recommended therapy, which I'm going to get to in a minute. However, a psychologist who is completing these evaluations does not understand what breaks down the meltdown cycle, so they are going to recommend individual therapy, typically. And when they recommend individual therapy, that is a clear indicator that the psychologist is not aware of what breaks the meltdown cycle, because individual therapy is not effective. The child cannot report what they're struggling with when they are overwhelmed, and half of the time not fully cognizant cognitively when they're in emotional overwhelm enough to report and use skills taught on a one-on-one basis with a professional. Highly sensitive kids struggle with this immensely, okay? So what happens if you have a school that's telling you, your kid needs a psych eval because they're struggling in this way, and you know that your kid's highly sensitive, and this is the traditional school's way of traditionally solving these problems, but you have a factor where your child is a minority, 1 out of every 5. That means 20% of the population, human population, is highly sensitive, and only a portion of that 20% is having daily meltdowns. And so you're a minority of a minority, right? Your child fits in that criteria. However, the traditional model is being proposed to gather information and to direct the support for your child. So it's incredibly important for you as a parent to be informed in order to advocate well and in order to understand what you will or will not get from that avenue of discovery of understanding your child. So typically what I see is about 10 pages of a report, okay? And 9 of those pages are the summarized data of each assessment. So you'll see psychological jargon and test results, not the answers that the child gave you. The psychologist won't give you that. They will give you the summary and the results once they've analyzed the answers and compiled them in a formatted way that is designed by the psychological testing company. And so what you're going to get is a paragraph per test and a data set per test, typically. That's about 9 pages in a 10-page report. Maybe 7 pages, something like that, where the first page is a paragraph, a couple paragraphs or two of a background history, family history. They're gonna interview you as a parent or ask you some questions, through a survey to help write a narrative of your child's history, background history as well, and behavior history. And then there will be the data set, and then one page, typically it's one page, sometimes even shorter than that because it's a bulleted list of suggestions, okay? So the psychological evaluation is the main part of the report, is the analysis of the tests. Once the psychologist gets that whole analysis, they put it all together, they read and score every test, read the answers, score it. They are then going to say, based on how most children perform, your child performs in a, you know, compares in a category, compares to, you know, 90% of the class, or 90% of the children who have been tested and this test has been validated against. Your child is advanced because they score above 90% of their peers when tested with this test, or your child, it fits in 10%, you know, which is the opposite side. For example, 90% of your child's peers perform differently than, and better on this test than your child. And so that's the format. Okay, so without getting into the nitty gritty, that's what an evaluation looks like. And you're left with that information, right? They're going to take that information. So say, for example, they might do a reading comprehension evaluation and a working memory evaluation and they might do an autism screening, and they might do or they might rule it out based on observation of your child in the classroom if they do that, or your history, your reported history of their behavior. And then they might they might do a depression scale or an anxiety scale. One assessment typically is what schools will house in their directory, because schools are not equipped, and you will not get a mental health diagnosis from a school psychologist. You will get a suggestion to go get evaluated after that with individual therapists and be diagnosed if the psychologist thinks that that's relevant, because schools will not provide a mental health diagnosis. For a psychological evaluation that is done outside of the home, outside of the school, the psychologist, right, may very well give a mental health diagnosis, and they would likely give more testing in order to rule out different types of mental health diagnoses: anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, mood disorders, to include disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which is the child version of bipolar disorder. They just changed the name so that you don't get alarmed. And then I'm kidding about that, but that's really what happened. And then they may or may not feel equipped to diagnose autism or assess for it. And so when all of this is happening, the experience that you're having reading this test, the psychologist is typically trained to read the evaluation with you, review it with you, meet with you, and then walk you through their recommendations. That is the high level of service. Years and years ago when I worked with psychologists who were completing evaluations of this nature at the agency that I worked with, this is what would happen. It would take weeks to complete the evaluation, to draw up the results, and then they would sit for like a 2.5-hour assessment meeting post-assessment meeting, and support the parent in understanding the answers that the child gave, not the actual bubble filled in answers, but the summary of each evaluation, so that the parent understood what the evaluation says, and then also what the psychologist is recommending based on the evaluation's results. Now, here's what usually happens. Especially now with telehealth involved, we have parents who are receiving an email, and the psychological workup, the 10-page thing, is emailed to the parent through encrypted service, and then maybe the psychologist will meet with you. And I hate to say it like that, but that's typically what happens. That's typically what happens. You are expected to read it on your own. And so when I was seeing clients in the private practice, as well as in supporting clients when they come in with a psych eval now to work with us directly with our programming, they give it to us and we interpret it, and they'd never actually been shared. Like that's never been a meeting. Psychologist ethically is obligated to read it to you and help you understand it and answer questions. And it's typically true that they're quite overwhelmed and not do. I mean, that's my assumption. I'd like to assume the best, that they're not setting up these meetings and it's not happening. Okay, so we have a lot of parents who are receiving these evals and having no idea what they actually mean. So next we have, like I said, 7 to 9 pages worth of the 10-page report. For example, they're not all exactly 10 pages. And then the last page is a bulleted list. Here are some book recommendations. Here are some, parenting skills that you should use. And typically what we see is a behaviorist approach because, remember, psychologists are taught in grad school to take a behaviorist approach. And I say remember because if you've been following me and watching different shows or listening to us on different platforms, this is what I've mentioned before. So what is that? Sticker charts, reward charts, and dangling carrots for your kid. And oh my gosh, when you're stuck in this pattern, that's not working, okay? So what happens, right? You're left with a piece of paper and you're like, yep, already read that book. Yep, already tried that. Doesn't work, okay? So it's really important to notice that the only reason why a psychological evaluation would be necessary is if your child needs an official level of support, documented level of support, like a 504 plan or an IEP, individualized education plan. And you would be advocating for that as a parent because it's less likely, especially for highly sensitive kids, that the school is volunteering that as an option. And so it's up to you to advocate for that. Okay. So lastly, myth number 3 I want to cover here before we talk about what is available to you next to have a great support system in place for you guys and something you can take action on today to become even more empowered to support your sensitive child to be successful in school. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay. Myth number 3 is that psych evals end the meltdown cycle, right? We just talked all about where the flaws are in this model and what gaps they leave. And it's really important that you understand that getting the information from this lens of viewing your child is missing the temperament type and also the temperament type stuck in the meltdown cycle and what actually works, right? So oftentimes when a sensitive child is struggling in school, and struggling meaning they're having meltdowns, they're wanting to walk out, or they're shutting down, sleeping, stuck in many different ways, having aggressive episodes in the school, etc. This avenue can be necessary to get 504 support or IEP support, but it is not going to end the meltdown cycle, neither in the school nor at home. And this is critically important for you to notice because getting that information is different than experiencing transformation, okay? You are the parent for your child, and you are the catalyst for breaking out of the meltdown cycle. You are your child's advocate, you are your child's guide, and you are your child's best chance for feeling better about themselves, both in school and at home, whether your child is struggling in both environments or just one of them. And this is very, very important because we hear parents who say one of many things. My kids' teachers would be floored. They are agape. Their mouths are agape when I tell them how much my child struggles at home because they are a perfect little angel at school, right? Or my child's teachers have no idea that I have been trying so hard for many, many years to help my child manage their emotions and have talked to them out the wazoo about how to feel better in school, talk to their teachers about where they're struggling, ask their teachers for help, and yet they're not doing that. Instead, they're just exploding. And I feel disempowered in this dynamic because it makes me feel like a bad parent when the school is saying, your kid is struggling and you need to do something about it and you need to get outside help. And not really knowing where to turn, and not feeling like an equal member of the team in directing your child's education and directing your child's mental well-being. As a parent, your child's mental well-being and emotional well-being is your job. That is your job, and that is your responsibility. And it's also true that they're in the school setting and getting overwhelmed, especially if they're highly sensitive. And it is critical for you to be able to understand where their gaps are and what the school needs to be aware of so that they can tackle that regardless of what supports they put in place, regardless of if they put supports in place at all. Because breaking out of the meltdown cycle requires support for you at home, and you're going to need to be able to tackle both. So related to school, here's what I have for you to get started on breaking out of this pattern and to handle any of the stressors that you're experiencing, especially right now coming out of the Christmas break and hearing reports from your schools, from your kids' school, or dealing with some of these challenges at home. And so we have an event that we are running on February 3rd, 2023, and a portion of that is free. Okay, so I want you to pay attention. We are going to support you in understanding how your child fits the highly sensitive trait. And then for parents who continue to engage with us in that event, there is an option to upgrade to work with me directly for several hours on Friday, February 3rd. Okay, and you are going to get to understand exactly how to advocate for your child in the school, know exactly what your child needs, whether it be to direct the school towards official support or not. And then lastly, know exactly how to advocate for supports that you need right now and have that direction. That level of clarity, as well as clear action steps to articulate your kids' needs and know how to be an equal player in this school dynamic, is going to be invaluable and great news. Part of that discovery component, so understanding your kid is how your kid fits in the highly sensitive trait, that part is going to be free. Again, the only thing that you need to do, though, in order to have access to that free content is to register. Everybody needs to be registered for the event in order to get access to it, okay? For those of you who upgrade to the elite level and you stay on for the call, that will take at least 3 hours total. For that workshop, we are going to support you live, and you'll get access to the replay, okay? So go ahead over to this link, meganthompsoncoaching.com/school, to support your child in breaking out of any sort of patterns that they have related to school struggle and help them become successful in the school setting. Now, you're wondering, is this only related to my kid is in public school? Is this necessary? My kid is in private school. Is this necessary? My child actually attends an emotionally intelligent charter school. Is this necessary? If your child is struggling with meltdowns and having a hard time in the school setting or right after school, then yes, this is relevant. Okay, you're definitely going to want to check it out and pay attention to how your child's personality trait pertains to their school environment. All right, so go ahead over to the site, and you'll click the link above this post or in the show notes, wherever you're watching or listening in here. And again, that's for February 3rd, 2023 at 4 p.m. Eastern.